The following is a Brother Asks and Building Better Builders video education series production.
Welcome back to episode 5 of Logical Fallacies with your host, Coach John Agee, and our special guest, Nick Adair, on Logical Fallacies. Nick, how are you?
Doing fantastic, John. How's everything going with you?
We've got a nice 85 degrees right now, and 85 degrees, yes. No rain expected until around 7:30 tonight. And at that particular point, I'll be, cuddled up with my beautiful bride with a nice wine glass in one hand and, a remote in the other. So you had some more logical fallacies that you wanted to cover. And
yeah,
we're on
as
number
a matter
9
of
right
fact,
now.
I'm sorry. I talked over top of you.
We're on number 9 right now. Would you like to go right into your presentation?
Absolutely. I have it pulled up and ready to go here. And the first one we have on today's presentation is what's called the bandwagon fallacy. Now, the bandwagon fallacy is confused sometimes with what I would call a branch of bandwagoning called the pile-on. The flaw of the bandwagon argument is that the popularity of an idea has absolutely no bearing on its validity. If it did, then the Earth would have made itself flat for most of history to accommodate the popular belief. The idea of the bandwagon argument is just because everybody agrees with it doesn't necessarily mean it's true. So we're kind of going at the concept of getting the truth out of an argument or discussion, not winning the argument or discussion. The whole Earth being flat is a great concept because Galileo sailed around the world and came back and said, "Hey, this place is round." But everybody at the time apparently thought it was flat because you can look out your door and look down the street; it's flat. So, but Galileo was the one that wasn't wrong. So everybody else was on the bandwagon of saying that the world's flat.
So the premise here is that people will tend to want to believe what is being stated as truth only because it is accepted by popular opinion that it is. But
absolutely
no
correct.
investigation.
Not always no investigation. Just sometimes it's just a common understanding of things that we think we know, or things that we are told that we know, probably when we were kids, and we just never challenged it because it was something that we were taught. But yeah, that's the concept of the bandwagon. The offshoot of the bandwagon, or what would be called the pile-on, is when somebody else starts agreeing with a premise, and then a bunch of people jump on board with that premise, and now all of a sudden you're outnumbered. And you can be outnumbered and still be right. That's the whole idea of getting to the truth.
And this happens online all the time, where an individual speaks a truth and he gets swarmed by a bunch of flying monkeys that surround him and start attacking him for what it is that's being stated, because it is not accepted by the swarm as their truth.
Absolutely correct. Yeah. Here's a prime example. So what we have is Seamus pointed a drunken finger at Sean and asked him to explain how many people could believe in how so many people could believe in leprechauns if they're only a silly old superstition. Sean, however, had too many pints of Guinness himself and fell off his chair. So Seamus is trying to say that leprechauns exist because enough people believe in them. And Sean is saying, I don't think so, because there's no proof that leprechauns actually exist. Well, they must, because everybody believes in it. That would be a bandwagon argument.
And a response to the bandwagon argument is you might get swarmed in the bar by a bunch of leprechaun believers at that particular point, and then you're basically dealing with a bunch of individuals who are reinforcing that bandwagon mentality.
Yes, we see this a lot nowadays. If that would have happened in this bar, if he would have got swarmed, Sean wouldn't have fallen off his chair. They'd have knocked him off his chair. Well, that's the tough part. If you say something that you know to be true, the other people don't believe it because of the bandwagon, they're all on board, then you're immediately you're in the minority. You've got 8 people pointing at you saying, I know leprechauns are true or real, and you're the one person there saying no, they're not. There's really no way to win that discussion. There's really no way to assert your point because they're all in agreement that they do exist, and you're the one saying that there's no evidence saying that leprechauns exist at all.
And as you've said before, it has nothing to do with winning. It has to do with finding the truth. And
Yes.
the difference is in a bar atmosphere, there is a win-lose situation, whereas if you're seeking the truth, the truth is not necessarily what everybody is believing. And then you have to basically start looking and investigating to find out what the truth is, but not seeking it from popular opinion.
Absolutely. So Sean falling off his chair here, I'm more apt to believe Sean kind of got off of his bar stool, hit the floor, and tried to crawl to the door because there was really nothing that he could do at that point. The only way you can combat a bandwagon argument is to give the other side time to research it and do the information on it themselves to see if they ever get to the same uh, point that you're at, where you understand what the truth is and they don't.
Awesome. What's the next one?
The next one up is the begging the question. This is one of the most famous ones, just like the slippery slope. We talked about that one before. This is the one that people will actually use by name. They will say it out loud. Well, that begs the question. I don't think they use it when they say that in the same term as the same way the fallacy presents it, but it is something that is directly brought out there. This is a logically incoherent argument. It often arises in situations where people have had an assumption that it is very ingrained and therefore taken in their minds as a given. Circular reasoning is bad mostly because it's not very good. It's the circular argument. It's the circular argument in which the conclusion is included in the premise. So if you say, this is bad, and they say, why is it bad? Well, because it's not good. That's a circular argument. You're basically saying the exact same thing. You are, in essence, begging the question that you're making up a question to what you just asked within the same statement.
Well, that's interesting. Forgive me for breaking into your presentation. I see begging the question very much as raising or posing a question that needs to be answered, but that's not the logical fallacy, is it?
Absolutely correct. That's what you'll hear that in the news all the time. They'll say somebody will stand up and say, French fries are poisonous. And then somebody will say, well, that begs the question, what kind of potatoes are you using? That's not exactly what we're talking about here. That's more of that's more of a catchphrase. Begging the question is what they say kind of out loud on the news just to kind of get your attention. It's one of those catch terminologies. But when you ask a question, a circular argument, French fries are poisonous because of the poison that's inside of them. That is, somebody will say, well, that will beg the question, what kind of poison? Well, it's the French fry poison.
So
What?
begging the question is more along the lines of you're not questioning the premise, and therefore when you don't question the premise, you're begging the question because the question of whether the premise is valid or not has not been posed. Is that what I'm hearing?
The question and the answer are posed in the exact same statement.
Wow.
And it's a circular argument. So again, this is one of those ones you really have to pay attention to. And it's a little bit misleading because when you hear somebody say begging the question, they're actually asking a question. But when you hear a circular argument within a statement, that's the logical fallacy of begging the question.
Do you have an example of that?
Nothing I've seen recently that has done that, but generally it's one of the things I see a lot is Billy Bob was indicted on charges of robbery because he was found at somebody else's house. Well, when you hear that in the news, people immediately go, oh, he must have robbed the place. No, he was indicted. That's different than being sentenced. So because our brains immediately, because when you see that on the news or in the media, our brains immediately go to, oh, that guy was robbing that person. The the statement was he was indicted on robbery because they caught him at somebody's house. It could have been burglary, it could have been breaking and entering, but the premise in the question causes a circular argument to answer itself. And it's not necessarily the truth.
Thank you. Your next slide, does that give some more insight?
I do have an example for sure.
Wonderful, wonderful.
The word of Zorbo the Great is flawless and perfect. We know this because it says so in the great and infallible book of Zorbo's best and most truest things that are definitely true and should not ever be questioned. So
that's a great example.
I've never been to one of Zorbo's shows, but I hear his book is fantastic and everything he says is in that book and flawless. One of the things, and I'm gonna point a finger at an author that I'm talking to. One of the things that people tend to do is when they do research, and especially Masonic research, and they put the information out there, they back the research up, they back their statements up with research. Zorbo here is backing his statements up with his own statements.
That's typical of why should I do that? Because I said so?
That's basically what it breaks down to, because I said so. But what he would say is, well, here's a prime example, a quote from your book that you have. Go ahead and give me any little tidbit of information from one of your books.
Oh, you're putting me on the spot.
Yeah, no, there's a lot there, but anything that you can, that kind of pops into your mind. You talk a lot about the point within a circle, and that comes back to doing a lot of Masonic research on the point within a circle, and you kind of explain the process as you go. But if somebody were to say, how do you know that? And you said, well, I know that because I wrote it down right here.
Oh, geez. Okay.
Instead
of saying, well, because I wrote it down here, I turn around and say, well, remember when you entered into the lodge and you went around a certain collection of objects in a circular fashion?
Exactly. That's backing up your information. But if you were to say, well, it's in my book, here it is, this is what it's all about. It's you basically saying that you cited yourself.
And that goes to the appeal of authority?
Well, it does. As a matter of fact, it goes right to appeal to authority, because that's our next one.
A score! I win the internet. Oh, nice lead in.
That's a very good lead in.
Thank you.
Appealing to authority is. I'm glad that begging the question kind of goes right to that, because if somebody is an authority on the subject, it's very easy to understand where they're coming from, even if they quote unquote cite themselves. If you cite yourself, you still have to be able to back that information up from your citing. But we'll get to that here in a second. Appealing to authority. It's important to note that this fallacy should not be used to dismiss the claims of experts or scientific consensus. That's one of the biggest parts here. Appeals to authority are not valid arguments, but nor is it reasonable to disregard the claims of experts who have demonstrated depth of knowledge unless one has a similar level of understanding. Basically saying that because an authority thinks something, it must therefore be true. A long time ago, I saw an ad in a magazine. It was for a watch. It was a really nice watch, like a Bulgari or something like that. And the person wearing it was Pierce Brosnan. And basically, that ad is telling me that the guy that plays James Bond knows more about watches than anybody else. Well, he's an actor. He's not an authority on watches. He's just advertising the watch. So the ad was trying to appeal to an authority that didn't exist.
Yeah, definitely setting up the audience to assume that the guy who plays James Bond knows what he's talking about when it comes to watches.
Exactly. Here's a prime example of appeal to authority. So not able to defend his position that evolution isn't true, Bob says that he knows a scientist who also questions evolution and presumably isn't herself a primate.
Yeah, yeah, that's the ticket.
We do this a lot, and one of the worst offenses of the appeal to authority is I saw it on the news or I read it on the internet. That technically is an appeal to authority, even though we all know at this point if it's on the internet, it's got to be true. That's what people do. I read it on the Washington Post. I saw it on Snopes. I read it in the newspaper. These are all appeals to authority, because the assumption is that the person who uh, published the article or placed the information is the authority on that subject. Unfortunately, they're not.
Yeah, yeah, it's pretty straightforward. And I've seen a lot of things unfold over the last few months that it's one thing after the other where authorities were they weren't quite right with what it was that they were saying, and we're finding out only now how much the appeal to authority was manifested in decision making going on endlessly by people in positions of power, that they were relying on authority figures in the field to make decisions.
In a lot of court cases, whenever they need an expert opinion, they will bring in an expert, and that is not an appeal to authority. That is there's no appeal there. They are getting the testimony from somebody who is an authority on that subject. That's why they don't bring in any Tom, Dick, or Harry to testify. They actually have to bring in an expert. So when we do the appeal to the authority, what we're doing is we're pretending that the person or the organization that we're talking about knows everything that there is to know about the subject. So, um, prime example, and I mean no disrespect to the guy, but if Bob wants to build a rocket in his backyard, he should be allowed to do that because Bill Nye, the science guy, says that's okay. Well, Bill's not a rocket scientist. He is a different type of scientist. But because he's a scientist, Bob throws him into the appeal to authority. We're going to go ahead and just assume that Bill knows everything there is to know about rockets. And who's going to argue with him? We don't know Bill well enough to know if he knows anything about rockets or not.
The I guess the thing where I'm the thinking where I'm going right now is: are there times when pieces of information can be thrown out on the table for scrutiny that come from authority figures or authoritative sources that are backed with research that helps support the search for truth?
Yeah. Stephen Hawking is a prime example with his theory of, or his Big Bang theory and how the universe was formed. Obviously, there's no definitive proof, but by going through the scientific process, he has put everything together in uh, kind of a full form. But when it comes to theory of relativity and things like that, I believe that Stephen Hawking is the authority, or was anyway, the authority on that subject.
But we're not using Stephen Hawking's himself, like Stephen said it, so therefore it's more along the lines of, here's the research that Stephen was responsible for authoring, or here's the theory that he's put forth, and it's worth considering. More along those lines rather than saying, well, Stephen said it, so therefore.
Yeah, the tough part here is you could use Stephen Hawking in an appeal to authority argument, but if you use Stephen Hawking's research, you would not be appealing to authority. You would be using the correct information. But if you just fired off, well, that was in Stephen Hawking's book. Well, what was? I don't remember. It was just there. He said it was bad, so we're not going to use it. That's more of an appeal to authority because you threw out, basically, you dropped a name. You dropped Stephen Hawking's name, and everybody is going to perk their ears up and listen. Whereas what the real point of the argument would B would be to use his research, citing it the proper way, giving him credit for it, and saying, this is why I believe the same thing.
Great, thank you.
You bet.
That wraps up 3 for this set. We're almost 20 minutes in, so I think we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. You've had Nick Adair and John Nagy talking about 3 more logical fallacies in episode number 5, and we'll be back next week with episode 6. Any preview that you'd like to give us a little tease with?
Absolutely. Next week we're going to continue with the appeal portion of it. We're going to appeal to nature. We're also going to talk about composition division. That's a big one nowadays. And we'll probably also talk about anecdotes.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nick. Once again, you've had Nick Adair and John Nagy talking about logical fallacies. We've we've been going at this 5 episodes, and stay tuned for episode number 6. Until then, be well and take care. Travel light.
You've been watching A Brother Asks and Building Better Builders video education series production.